This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. The recent Key Bridge collapse in Baltimore has put a spotlight on the state of infrastructure across the U.S. Here in Connecticut, 5% of bridges are in poor condition. That's according to the American Road and Transportation Builders Association. Today, we talk about the state of our bridges and roads here in Connecticut and what needs to be done to improve them. And later, we'll hear about green infrastructure and the workforce behind it. But first up, joining us now is Jim Haddadin, who's the editor for our accountability project here at Connecticut Public, which is an investigative reporting team. Thanks, Jim, for being with us today.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
And we also have Ron Harichandran, who's the dean of the Tagliatela College of Engineering at the University of New Haven. Thank you so much, Ron, for joining us today.
Happy to be here, Catherine.
And for our listeners, let us know if you have any questions, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Ron, I want to start with you and also by talking about the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse in Baltimore recently. You know, as an engineer, can you tell us what was your first reaction when you saw that happening?
Well, it's not often that we see a collapse of that spectacular nature or magnitude. It's a rare occurrence. There have been a few like that in the past, but nevertheless, I haven't seen one like that in recent times. So first of all, it was just the sheer magnitude and the visual stunningness, really, of the collapse, something that one normally wouldn't expect of a structure of that kind. And of course, the immediate thought that occurs is how many casualties there are or were in that particular collapse. And I think to some extent it is always tragic when lives are lost, and lives were lost in this particular collapse as well. But it could have been a lot worse. So in that context, I think we have to look at both sides. It was a tragedy, but at the same time, it could have been much worse.
And what do we know about the accident so far and also the state of the bridge?
So the accident was caused, obviously, now that people have read about it extensively, I'm sure, by the impact of a very, very large container vessel that lost its power and therefore was unable to be controlled by the crew and drifted and hit one of the two main concrete piers that supports the bridge or supported the bridge, and basically destroyed that pier, and that led to progressive collapse of the bridge very quickly. So that was the incident that caused the failure. Right now they are trying to clear out the debris of the bridge in the waterway because Baltimore also is a very important port, transporting lots of, even cars and other consumer items and so on into Baltimore for shipping. And so there is urgency in getting the waterway opened, at least so that the shipping can resume. So that's the first order of business. And of course, there's a terrible disruption to motorists because that bridge was a strongly traveled interstate highway. So however, reconstruction of the bridge is going to take a while, probably a couple of years at least.
And as you mentioned, Ron, that it's important to mention that it was a cargo ship that hit one of the piers of the bridge, and it kind of started to tumble. And it's also worth sort of reemphasizing that this was an enormous cargo ship. And Pete Buttigieg, who is the U.S. Secretary of Transportation, has said earlier last week that any bridge would have been damaged with what happened. But Ron, are there any concerns over how easily this bridge collapsed?
Not really. I think I agree with Peter Buttigieg on this. A vessel of that size and weight, although it was perhaps not traveling as fast, nevertheless imparts a huge energy onto the bridge, when it impacts. So irrespective of what kind of bridge it might have been, if it hit one of the main supporting piers of, and most bridges have two or more supporting piers. And typically in any of those bridges, if one of them were to be destroyed by an impact of that magnitude, it would most likely lead to collapse of the bridge. So I agree on that view.
Right, and I think there's been a lot of mention that this is a really unique situation, really, but it also, I think, really had a lot of states and people kind of look more broadly at how our infrastructures are across the country and also more narrowly in our own state here in Connecticut. So, Ron, can you tell us what do we know about the state of some of our roads and bridges here?
Yes, so this is something that has been talked about probably for now more than a decade. That America's infrastructure is in bad shape. Much of this, the highway system was built during the Eisenhower period. So a lot of these structures that exist today are 50 or more years old. A typical lifespan of bridges or of severe infrastructure is 50 to 70 years max. So we are approaching the lifetime of these structures, and we have to be careful in terms of inspection and making sure that the structures are still safe to travel on and so on. And the Connecticut Department of Transportation is responsible within the state of Connecticut for the highway bridges to inspect annually and ensure that they are safe and so on. Fortunately, I think with the Biden administration's recent infrastructure bill, there will be an infusion of funds, or there already is an infusion of funds to try to address some of these infrastructure deficiencies, all the way from repair to replacement.
And you mentioned, a lot of these infrastructures are quite old. Can you talk about the costs behind making improvements and the upkeep, and who should be funding or who can fund these projects?
Yeah, so the cost is huge, and that's why, to some extent, we let it get this bad, because it does take literally millions or billions of dollars. I mean, the reconstruction of the Key Bridge is probably going to cost $1 billion with a B. So if you look at the several hundreds of bridges that need work, that need to be repaired and replaced, we are talking a lot of money. And obviously, these are most of them in the highway system are used both for public use as well as for commercial use. And the revenue, really, we don't, in Connecticut at least, have toll highways or toll bridges. So we don't have revenue coming in that form. So it's the gas tax dollars that are used to repair these structures.
So I want to
Now,
bring. Oh,
yeah,
go
go
for
ahead.
it. Go for it. Go for it.
No, so I mean, unless we have certain infusion of funds like the infrastructure bill that's currently happening. So sometimes the federal government does infuse special funds that are outside of the gas tax dollars that can help with this.
And so I want to bring in Jim, who's our editor for the Accountability Project here at Connecticut Public, also known as the TAP team, and that they also did reporting last year on Connecticut's roads and bridges. So, Jim, I want to start by asking too, what was the inspiration for the reporting? Why did the team want to look at roads and bridges?
Yeah, last year there was an announcement from the state that a very significant project was going to get underway at the Gold Star Memorial Bridge, which carries 95 over the waterway down between New London and Groton. That was, as you were just hearing our guest comment, made possible through some federal funding that came through the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed in November 2021. So that is kind of a tangible example for people of how some of that money is being put to work in the community. And something like $158 million that were going toward that project. And I think just the sheer scale of how much money was required for a project like this got us thinking, boy, that's a lot of money. I wonder what it would take to fix up some other bridges in the state. What is the kind of outstanding cost for some of these repairs that might be needed at this point? So that's what we started looking at. Well, what is the condition of bridges more broadly in Connecticut? And what we found was when you look at bridges that are among those listed in the National Bridge Inventory, so this is not every bridge in Connecticut, but generally some of the more significant ones that carry highway roads, We found about 5%, as you mentioned, or about 225 bridges were rated as being in poor condition. That is a very specific term that means a specific thing under these federal rules, but it's when you look at the three different components of a bridge, the area you're driving over, the substructure beneath it, and so forth, if any of those fall below a 5 on a 9-point scale, the bridge is rated in poor condition. So it doesn't mean that the bridge is unsafe as of this moment. It's still passable, but it's something that is kind of being flagged for concern or a need of repair or replacement.
I also want to take a moment here to bring in Bartholomew Sweeney, who is Connecticut Department of Transportation's Division Chief Engineer who oversees bridges. Bartholomew, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. And just clarify, I am the division chief for the bridge division.
Division chief for the bridge division. There you go.
Yes, I am. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. And you've been listening to the conversation and would love to have you respond so far about the state of bridges and also the bridge collapse that happened in Baltimore recently.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So I do need to emphasize, and it's been previously stated, that the emphasis is on public safety with our structures. So I do need to emphasize Connecticut bridges are safe. If there were any concerns, Connecticut would be immediately reacting and restricting access, closing, making repairs. So public safety is certainly number one. Connecticut devotes a significant amount of resources annually to ensure the bridge infrastructure remains safe for all modes of travel, either carried on or passing below. We inspect the structures at least once every 2 years, more often if required. But due to the unfortunate collapse in Baltimore last week, Connecticut DOT, like many other agencies across the country that either own or maintain bridges, began immediately assessing the bridge inventory. And specifically, we wanted to confirm whether there was any vulnerabilities regarding vessel impacts. Obviously, that was a tragedy that happened, and we wanted to ensure that we had no vulnerabilities. And I will say Connecticut is responsible. Connecticut DOT is responsible for inspection and maintenance of approximately 4,200 highway bridges throughout the state. 39 of those, the initial assessment determined 39 of the 4,200 cross navigable waterways. And we also do have responsibility for the rail structures in the state. So 6 of our rail structures actually cross navigable waterways as well. So the initial focus right after the Baltimore collapse was to assess these 45 structures, and the goal was to determine whether we had any sort of risk due to vessel impacts on these structures. And most of these 45 structures have the protection systems that were discussed that are in front or adjacent to the foundations of the piers, and those are the foundation elements that are in the waterway. And these external protection systems, fenders and dolphins, are really intended to either redirect or absorb the energy from the impact to ensure the safety of the structure, limit the damage to the structure, and certainly limit a catastrophic failure. But 9 of our structures, so we have 45 that cross navigable waterways. 9 of these do not have these external devices protecting these substructure units. But I will say the initial assessment of these 45 did determine that there was no immediate threat. Gold Star, which is our largest structure in our inventory, it's New London Groton, and it carries I-95 over the Thames. Largest bridge in our inventory is included in the 9 that do not have external protections. So as a part of the project that was just mentioned that is ongoing on the Gold Star right now, a vessel impact study was performed. And that's typically performed when we have projects on any of our structures crossing navigable waterways. And the vessel study that was done for Gold Star did confirm that the Gold Star structure is safe without any external protection devices, protecting the piers in the waterway. And in general, this is due to the sheer mass of the piers that support the structure, and as compared to the size, the type, the loading condition, the frequency of vessels that are expected to pass below the Gold Star. Connecticut, as was stated, Connecticut does not see the large container-type vessels like Baltimore sees, but we do have a fair amount of commercial vessels that are in our waterways, and those commercial vessels are still significant size. To put it in perspective, the the vessel that struck Baltimore was around 100,000 tons. The Gold Star study that was done on the piers considered the vehicle that controlled there, or the vessel that controlled there, was a 20,000-ton vessel. So not a small vessel, but again, that vessel does not pose any risk to the Gold Star structure without having any external fenders or piers there.
Right. And earlier, Ron touched on this a little bit, but we'd love for you to also give us an idea of the cost when it comes to keeping up with infrastructure like this. Can you give us an idea of what it takes to do major repairs or replacements when you are doing those major repairs and replacements?
It obviously varies due to the type of repairs we're doing and the size of the structures that we're doing them on. But as mentioned, it's certainly in the millions, and it could get to the billions on some of these major structures. We have numerous projects ongoing right now on our major structures in Connecticut, and it is millions and millions of dollars. And thankfully, we have the current federal transportation bill that provided significant increases that are allowing us to make more substantial investments in our infrastructure, and that's been extremely helpful in how we are scoping our projects and programming work. We're able to look at life cycle more closely and make decisions based on life cycle. So we're not just continuously repairing. We're able to make more long-term permanent repairs, and oftentimes it's replacements on our infrastructure.
And Jim, before we go to break, we'd love to get some final thoughts from you, especially since you've done some reporting here. Any thoughts about future reporting? Your take on the bridge collapse in Baltimore, struggling there a little bit, or anything you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I will say I had an opportunity to chat with some of the folks from DOT a little earlier this week, and I know they're going to be doing some ongoing work, just continually assessing this question of these navigable bridges, and are there additional steps that the state of Connecticut could take or should take in light of what's happened there? So I think I'm certainly very interested to hear what some of that research produces, but I learned as part of this process that these type of vessel impact studies do take place regularly, particularly when a bridge is rehabbed. So as a gentleman was just saying from DOT, they have done that work within the last few years for the Gold Star in particular. So that's an area that they have really thought through. And the other thing that really struck me in that conversation is there are ports that you reach without actually having to go under a bridge in the areas along the coast in Connecticut. So we have 3 deep water ports here in New Haven, New London, Bridgeport, and they actually have a lot of the shipping that comes and goes there is ships that are not going to need to pass under the bridge to get where they need to go to drop off their cargo. That's maybe another way that we're somewhat different here in Connecticut than what you might see in the bigger shipping ports in Baltimore.
Well, thank you so much for that. You've been listening to Jim Haddadin, who's our editor for our TAP team here at Connecticut Public. Thanks so much, Jim, for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
You are also listening to Ron Harichandran, who's the dean of the Tagliatela College of Engineering at the University of New Haven. Thank you so much, Ron, for being with us today.
You're welcome.
And you were also just listening to Bartholomew Sweeney, who's with the Connecticut Department of Transportation. Thank you, Bart, for calling in and joining us today.
Yep, thank you for having me.
And coming up next, we talk about infrastructure that might mitigate the impacts of climate change. And you can also join the conversation. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. When you think of the word infrastructure, you probably think of roads, bridges, or even dams. But there's also something called green infrastructure, things like rainwater harvesting and permeable pavements. They're supposed to help our towns, cities, and coastline mitigate extreme weather events and a changing climate. Joining us now to talk about it is Michael Dietz, who's an extension educator at the University of Connecticut and also the director of the Connecticut Institute of Water Resources. Thank you so much, Michael, for being with us this morning.
Catherine, it's my pleasure.
And for our listeners, let us know if you have any questions, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Michael, can you start by giving us an idea of what does green infrastructure really mean and what does that look like?
So this term has been around for a while. Historically, it was called low impact development. And this really started back in the 1990s down in Maryland when they were trying to solve some problems that they were having regarding non-point source pollution or runoff that was coming off of the developed surfaces and contributing to pollution in the Chesapeake Bay. So we started to implement those same practices up here. These are things that you mentioned, like rain gardens, permeable pavements, green roofs, really to try to reduce the impacts of our development on the landscape to ultimately protect one of our big water bodies here in the state, the Long Island Sound, and many of the smaller water bodies that contribute to it.
And as you mentioned just now, that this is something that started in the 1990s, and so it's not a new concept, but certainly something that I think it seems to be like it's catching on more, it's being adopted more. So can you talk about the role that's playing, and what do we know about how climate change is impacting our infrastructure?
Well, this is a bit complicated, and there are a lot of factors here. So
Sure.
the implementation, the broader implementation that's been happening in Connecticut, at least, has been driven by some regulation that happens. It's called MS4, or Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System Regulations. So this is something that DEEP promulgated, and the towns and cities that are subject to this regulation now have to at least make some substantial efforts to utilize these practices because they are aware of the benefits of them. The research over the years past has shown that these practices work. So many towns have been making better efforts to put these things into practice where they can. And the climate change impacts that you talked about, this is really, and this relates to the infrastructure and other things that Ron was mentioning before. So not only is our stormwater infrastructure, the pipes and culverts that convey our waters around the state, not only are they aging, just of their structures themselves, the way that these things were sized historically, if you go back 40, 50 years, they were using design storms that were based on earlier rainfall patterns. If you've lived in Connecticut for a number of years, you know that we are experiencing more intense storms now. And the data actually do show that. We are getting more intense rainfall events, heavier storms that are exceeding the capacity of our infrastructure that we have to convey that water safely. So not only is the infrastructure just aging in general, but it's really undersized now to handle these larger events.
And I definitely want to get back to the larger rain and flooding and storm events that we've been having and witnessing. And in fact, we just had a lot of rain just a couple days ago. But I want to also have you give us an idea. We talked about our permeable pavements and rainwater harvesting and also green roofs earlier. But can you tell us, exactly what do those elements do and how do they work?
Sure. So the main goal with all of the practices that are part of this program is to try to make the landscape function as it did before the development happened on there. So trying to replicate those natural processes of the water infiltrating into the soil, basically cleaning that water as it makes its way through the soil into the shallow groundwater and into our local streams. So it's what we call an ecosystem service. So our forests in the state really do that job for us on their own. And so we're trying with green infrastructure, the goal is really to implement these practices where we can in the developed environment to try to help that landscape act more as the undeveloped system. So the rain gardens are basically just a depression in the landscape that allows that water to come in from some sort of impervious surface, infiltrate into the ground. There are plants that are in there that are native to this area, so they don't have a lot of extra fertilizer or water requirements. They cycle some of those nutrients and take them up. And it also provides habitat for wildlife, for pollinators, as these plants do in the natural setting. Permeable pavements do the same type of thing. They allow that water to sink through the surface of the pavement instead of running off directly into a pipe system or directly into a brook or other waterway. And that water goes down into a storage layer beneath and then infiltrates into the soil. Green roofs, same type of thing, capture some of that water, store it temporarily, and allow it to evaporate and go back up to the atmosphere.
And it sounds like we have quite a variety of development here in Connecticut and from older cities like Hartford, New Haven to our coastal towns. Can you talk about what does green infrastructure look like here in Connecticut?
It does vary. Yes, it's a good point. So the concepts are the same, but the implementation of these things is different if you go from one of our rural towns, for example, to one of our more developed cities.
Right.
And it really just has to do with the challenges in the planning that you have to go through to implement the practice. The concept will be the same, but it's easier to put these practices in where you have less infrastructure in the way. So when you get into our bigger cities, there are conflicts with other utilities, you know, all the gas lines, sewer lines, water lines, you have other infrastructure that's underneath the ground, electrical. So it just becomes more challenging to actually get these things in the ground in the big cities. It doesn't mean it can't be done. It's being done in several of our cities in the state. And I would say that New Haven is really our leader right now. They have a program that they're implementing hundreds of bioswales in the city, which are basically the same thing as a rain garden, to get that water out of the system, sink it down into the ground. And even in our, like across the country, if you look at Washington, D.C., New York City, Philadelphia, these are some of our most built up landscapes, you know, around. And it's being done. It's not easy everywhere, but it is being done.
And you mentioned earlier that our state's been hit by some major storms and also an increase in rain, which also equals to bring in more flooding. Can you talk about how green infrastructure can help mitigate this?
Sure. And I think maybe the one thing to mention quickly here is
Sure.
that our big cities are in the state are really subject to something called combined sewer overflows. So most of our big cities were constructed, the sewer systems in these cities were constructed in the 1800s, where the stormwater, the runoff from these impervious surfaces, was directed into the sewer lines, basically to keep that system flushed out and moving. And in that era, there was no sewage treatment at the end of that pipe. The sewage went to the nearest river, and obviously that caused major problems. So we have sewage treatment facilities now that handle that, that treat that sewage. They also can handle some of that stormwater that enters into those systems. But the problem happens when we get bigger rainfall events, and that causes those facilities to have to discharge some of that untreated sewage and stormwater directly into our rivers and our estuaries in the state. So this is quite common. In fact, I just saw one for some of the intense rains that happened a couple of weeks ago up in either Springfield or Holyoke. They had a combined sewer overflow. So those things are happening. EPA is making the cities address this issue. So Hartford is drilling some giant tunnels underneath the city to store that combined sewer overflow and then send it to their treatment facility slowly over time. New Haven and Bridgeport are also separating those systems and trying to at least cut down on that stormwater volume that goes into that wastewater facility. However, getting back to your question now, green stormwater infrastructure in spread out in small ways across the city can have a dramatic impact. So this is really what New Haven is trying to accomplish with these small bioswale installations across the city. They know that one bioswale is not going to solve the combined sewer overflow problem that they have, and again, being exacerbated by these more intense storms that we're getting. But if you can put these things in broad scale across the city, it really can have a dramatic impact. And this is exactly what Philadelphia is doing. They realize that this approach, being able to incentivize small scale installation of green stormwater infrastructure across their city, was a economical way for them to address this issue, in addition to doing some separation of their sewer system.
Well, and building on what you just said too, because there can be a dramatic change if you can put these bioswales or rainwater gardens here. But I also want to talk about, in a realistic way, this is not a magic bullet that could just solve everything, but it could help with some of the climate change and flooding, it sounds like.
That's exactly right. The magnitude of the developed surfaces that we have here in the state, I would love to tell you that these things are going to solve all these problems, but there is just so much of it that when we get a hurricane, we haven't had a large hurricane like the ones from 1955 or the hurricane of 38. We get a storm like that now, the green infrastructure in place is not going to avoid problems and flooding and damage from something like that. But it can shave a little bit off of those totals for those small, let's say for sure the smaller storms to the medium-sized storms, and just reduce that burden on the downstream facilities like the combined sewer overflow system and the wastewater treatment facilities. But yes, you're right, Catherine, that, it's not a magic bullet that's just going to magically fix all of our flooding problems that we have. We just have so much development here in the state, and across the country. It's hard to deal with that in many ways.
I mean, we all wish to have that magic solution for all of our problems. So I think that's
right.
resonate with a lot of people. I do have a question from Ashton from Facebook. Ashton's asking, for folks who live on lakes that feed into the Long Island Sound, who are the best folks to contact to help adapt to the current and future climate issues for our landscape and our home?
Well, I guess if the question is about what individual homeowners can do, we do have some resources on our website. So my colleagues at the Center for Land Use Education and Research and myself, we've been doing this work for many years, and we have some resources for homeowners on how to install some green stormwater infrastructure yourself at your own residential home. If there are larger issues like communities along a lake, often the town is the best place to start, or a homeowners association, certainly, but the town will be aware of any issues that there may be, like septic systems causing problems with the lake or things like that, or other stormwater infrastructure. So I would say that, start, if you're asking about small scale, we can help with some of those resources on our website. The town also can provide some help if there are larger scale concerns.
Well, thank you so much, Ashton, for that question, and hopefully that was helpful for you. And Michael, before we go to break, I do want to ask, do you have any thoughts about getting more people involved in infrastructure work and creating more green infrastructure jobs? And, is that a thing that's happening now?
It definitely is. There are some great organizations in the state. So the New Haven installations that I mentioned, they were partnering with an organization called the Urban Resources Initiative. So that's a job training program, helping people to learn these job skills and install those bioswales in the city. There are also other organizations, and for example, one I've partnered with in New Haven called Neighborhood Housing Services. So we've done some trainings with them to help train landscapers and other public works folks on how to install these things. And we do continue to have some online resources. We have online rain garden certificate program, for example, on our website that's really targeted towards public works or landscape professionals or even homeowners. So it's something. There are definitely organizations in the state trying to do this. I think there's a growing need, as I mentioned, with all the other towns that are doing this stuff now. There is a need to have qualified landscape contractors to do this work.
And actually, really quickly, can you share with our listeners about the green infrastructure project that's happening at UConn?
Sure. So we have quite a few that have been installed here on campus, actually over 65 green stormwater features since 2004. And most recently, we have a group of students from the Soil and Water Conservation Society that had approached me last fall about trying to install another rain garden here on campus. And they wrote themselves a grant proposal to the university and got some funding. And I've helped them through that process a little bit. And we're going to be installing that right next to the dairy bar here at UConn in the next couple of weeks. So if you do visit campus and go for an ice cream, be sure to check out the rain garden next to the dairy bar.
Well, that sounds like an excellent plan. I will be doing that at some point. So thank you so much for letting us know, and obviously encourage our listeners to do the same. You've been listening to Michael Dietz, who's an extension educator at UConn and also director of the Connecticut Institute of Water Resources. Thank you so much, Michael, for being on the show today.
My pleasure, Catherine.
And coming up next, installing green infrastructure and updating our existing infrastructure means we're going to need a robust workforce. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're talking about infrastructure around our state. There's lots to be done, from maintaining aging roads and bridges to building more climate-friendly infrastructure. But infrastructure is one of many workforces that doesn't have enough people to fill the jobs. Last year, the State Department of Transportation said they were having problems hiring new employees, and Connecticut is facing a shortage of engineers to do the work. Joining us now to talk about it is Chris DiPentima, who's the president and CEO of Connecticut Business and Industry Association. Thank you so much, Chris, for joining us today.
Happy to be on. Thanks for having me.
So, Chris, last year, the DOT reported that they had a shortage of civil engineers in the state and that sort of contributed to slowing down efforts to upgrade and repair much-needed Connecticut roads and bridges. Can you give us an idea of what's happening here? Why are we seeing such a shortage of these workers?
Yeah, it's probably the biggest issue we've got going on in Connecticut is finding the workforce in every industry sector. And as you mentioned, DOT really challenged to find engineers, because they've got this demand from federal infrastructure dollars of more than $5 billion total funds received that they need to get out, to the private sector and into Connecticut to really improve our infrastructure. And the challenge on the workforce side, it certainly was increased during the pandemic, but it existed in Connecticut before the pandemic. We just had a declining labor force in the state because from 2008 to 2018, we saw some tough fiscal years in the state and higher taxes for individuals and businesses. And as a result, we saw almost 200,000 people leave the state of Connecticut over a 10-year period of time. And we saw a lot of businesses and jobs leave with that. Fortunately, the state started to turn around its fiscal health in 18 and 19 through a bipartisan agreement that created some spending guardrails. And while the pandemic was incredibly tragic on several levels, the Connecticut economy actually excelled coming out of the pandemic because of the way we handled it. And as a result, we saw quite a bit of demand for jobs and fully recovered all the jobs we lost in the pandemic. But we didn't have the supply, if you will. That population that we lost from 08 to 18 didn't get backfilled quick enough. In addition, we've got older demographics in the Northeast. And so we had a lot of people retire during the pandemic earlier than normal retirement age. And that created this kind of void, if you will, Catherine, of 90,000 job openings. And for a long time, only about 40 or 50,000 people looking for work. So almost 1.5 to 2 job openings for every person looking.
And with this 10-year gap, and certainly, unfortunately, this is not the only industry that was impacted. And I know there are many other areas that, either have a shortage of workers or basically echoing the same issues that you just mentioned. But can you talk about, what kind of jobs needs to be filled? What are the specific voids that needs to be filled?
It's all levels. If you look at infrastructure specifically, that's such a broad industry in Connecticut. It's, everything from, as you mentioned before with your prior guest, roads and bridges, airports, rail, buses, water, our energy areas, our utility, and you just had a good conversation with Mike about the green tech in our energy sector. Some people also include housing and childcare and infrastructure, and it's such a broad industry that it requires so many different skill sets. But from the job opening point of view, it's everything from entry level, your very first job, lowest skill set, to the high level advanced project managers, engineers, operations leaders. So it runs the gamut, and we're seeing that in every industry too. Quite honestly, it's not just the most advanced skills that are needed. It's job openings across the sector, and as a result, you need a very robust, dynamic workforce development system in order to match the supply with that demand by giving them certain skill sets.
And Chris, the reporting on the Baltimore Bridge collapse has mentioned that the victims were immigrants. So can you tell us, what does that tell us about the infrastructure workforce? Do immigrants or migrant workers play a big role in filling the gaps?
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why we saw some, the workforce decline, not only in Connecticut, but across the United States, was because a lot of the things that were happening with immigration and slowing immigration in the United States. They're a big piece of filling the workforce demands that we have in Connecticut and across the country. And in Connecticut, we've seen 3 years of population growth coming out of the pandemic. And when you look at those population growth numbers, most of those moving to the state are immigrants. We're not getting a lot of people relocating. We're seeing, state to state swap, but it pretty much neutralizes itself. So those moving in from New York is offsets maybe the folks that we lose to the southeastern states. But the population growth we've seen over the last 3 years, which is about 20,000 people, has mostly been, the net growth has been from immigration. So that's a critical component of growing our workforce, growing our population. And the key is then matching those folks, the skills they have or the skills they need with these 90,000 job openings, probably about 15,000 in infrastructure alone. And so that's a critical piece, is making them aware of the job training programs. Mike mentioned a couple of them that are happening, and there's even more, not many of them statewide, but a lot of them are very local workforce development programs.
Well, and then relating to growing the workforce or filling the gaps, Chris, is, when we think about infrastructure and construction labor, we often think about men filling these roles. So what can be done to attract more women to this industry?
Yeah, it's a critical area that we've got to focus on, because Connecticut has population is 52% female and 48% male. So if we're not tapping into the women workers or the women who could potentially be working, then we're not tapping into our population strength. And childcare is a big piece of that. We saw a lot of childcare facilities close down during the pandemic. Understandably, it was a really tough time. And most of them had to close for certain reasons, but they weren't able to, financially stay through it and recover and open up. And so that's an area that we focus on at CBIA, is expanding childcare, making it more affordable, and ensuring that we have quality, accessible childcare throughout the Connecticut. We see a lot of deserts in the state, especially in southeastern Connecticut. And as we know, women generally bear the brunt of domestic support, whether that's caring for elderly or caring for the children. And if they don't have a place to be able to put their child, whether that's infant care, toddler care, or pre-K, then they're not going to be able to participate in the workforce. And when you look at the labor participation numbers in Connecticut, it's pretty equal male to female for those who don't have children. But for those who have children under 6 years old in their household, the male participation rate is 97% in the workforce. The female labor participation rate is only 73%. Big discrepancy there. And it really comes down to not having enough childcare. We've heard a lot of stories of 1-2 year waiting lists to get into a childcare facility. And that's just a frustrating challenge that women then have to try to figure out how to overcome, rely on family members, or in most cases, they're just choosing not to participate in the workforce when they otherwise would want to and could be very active. And so that's solving the childcare crisis is just as important as solving housing crises and continuing to grow the population in Connecticut.
Right. And those are certainly areas that we've talked about a lot on the show, and it will be an ongoing conversation. And you mentioned earlier, too, which is another thing that I think is reflective of other industries, is about getting engineers to stay in Connecticut. You mentioned earlier that a lot of engineers might be getting their degrees here, but they're also moving out of the state. So is there any solutions to having them to stay here in the state?
Yeah, there's a lot of efforts going on to continue population growth in the state. Certainly lower the cost of living is something that the state continues to focus on, especially now that we're in a better fiscal condition than we were pre-pandemic. Last year was the largest tax decrease in Connecticut's history, really focused on folks who are making less than $150,000, $200,000. So that's that working class, many of them in the infrastructure sector and our engineers specifically. And keeping them here. And the state, that's why infrastructure is so critical to us being competitive. It's one of the 4 areas we look at when we look at economic competitiveness, along with business climate, workforce, and innovation. You've got to have a strong infrastructure around you in order for people to want to stay and move to your state. But in order to have that strong infrastructure, you need to have the workforce and the people moving to your state to build that infrastructure. And as you heard from Mike, we have a higher cost to build the infrastructure that's needed because we're an older state with older infrastructure that goes back to the 1800s. We're not a newer state that's starting from scratch, and that creates more dollars that need to be spent to build that infrastructure so that people want to move to Connecticut. They have easy access to their jobs. They can move about, live, work, and play. But in order to do that, you've got to have a state economy that's growing to make those investments. And in order to have that economy, you've got to have the people working and living here. So it's a bit of a circular reference, but we're continuing to lower the cost of living in Connecticut. I know the government's looking at property taxes now, like I mentioned, childcare, also lowering the cost of housing. Those are areas that we need to continue to focus on with policy solutions.
We got about 2 minutes left here, but I also want to ask you, especially what you just described, it sounds like, infrastructure in of itself is extremely broad. So there's probably a lot of different opportunities that people can find there. So can you talk about what programs or job training initiatives can listeners check out if they're interested in entering this field?
Yeah, the state, has done an incredible job building up the workforce development programs around here. And we actually had great workforce development programs even pre-pandemic. And we were fortunate to invest a lot of COVID dollars. And so on the infrastructure side, Hartford Public High School has an engineering and green technology pathway program that's run by a nonprofit named Ready CT that we're affiliated with. And so these are high school students. Over 200 participating in grades 9 through 12 in the Green Technology and Pathway Program, that are preparing them, giving them those skills in high school so that they can either get a job right after high school and go on to a green technology career or, go to a 2 or 4 year university, some of the great ones we have in Connecticut. In addition, the Connecticut State Building Trades, which is our state union, that developed training institutes for apprenticeship to get them into the infrastructure areas, especially the building trades specifically. And I know over the past year, they've produced more than 570 apprentices and have placed more than 470 of them in jobs. So the demand's there, and the workforce development programs are really robust. It's a matter of just connecting the individuals and getting more individuals into these workforce development programs.
Well, thank you so much for that. I hope listeners will find that helpful if you are interested in joining that industry. You've been listening to Chris DiPentima, who's the president and CEO of Connecticut Business and Industry Association. Thank you so much, Chris, for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me. Have a good weekend.
Right back at you. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you so much for listening.